Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ranjit Khanna and I'm the director of the Franklin Humanities Institute. And I am delighted to welcome you all here today for this Bookwatch event. Bookwatch has, since 2004, been one of FHI's signature events in which we collaborate with the library to celebrate the publication of a recent book and invite our colleagues, both local and distant, to come and engage with it. Unfortunately, Joe Salem, University librarian, can't be with us today, but sends best wishes, and I see that there are many colleagues actually from the library here. So thank you for representing him. Our co-sponsors for the event today are Gender, Sexuality and Feminist Studies, African American Studies, and the Trent Center for Bioethics, Humanities, and the History of Medicine. The Bookwatch event is designed to recognize and give particular attention in our field, to give particular attention to the ways in which in our fields the scholarly monograph is still seen as the primary form of long scholarship and the primary form of accomplishment, I suppose. I want to thank the library for hosting our event this year. We're going to follow the discussion with a reception to celebrate the accomplishment of our author, Jennifer Nash. And today, our respondents to Jennifer's book are Moon Shania, Associate Professor of International Studies at Spelman College, Jasmine Cobb, Professor of African American Studies at Duke, Deirdre Cooper Owens, Associate Professor of History at the University of Connecticut Storrs, Wam Wilson, Assistant Professor of Theological Ethics from Duke's Divinity School, and Joe Winters, who is the Alexander Haymeyer Associate Professor of Religious Studies here at Duke. Nikki Lane, who is Assistant Professor in GSF, is kindly moderating our panel today. So each year, colleagues from FHI and the library come together with a list of the books published by faculty members in the humanities, arts, and interpretive social sciences over the previous year, and we discuss them and decide who we should honor in this series. Previous Bookwatch events have been organized around books by, in reverse order, Richard Powell, Sumathi Ramaswamy, Charlie Pio, David Morgan, Richard Broadhead, Timothy Tyson, Michelle Longino, Nega Motahede, Andrew Janiak, and Liz Milovich all together, Laurent Dubois, Roberta Dinotto, Srinivasa Ravamadhan, Kate Hales, William Reddy, Carla Holloway, Michael Hart with Antonio Negri, Lavolia Glimpf, J. Cameron Carter, Margaret Humphreys, Margaret Greer, Walter Mignolo, Maureen Quilligan, Torrell Moy, Anne Allison, Barbara Hernstein-Smith, and Kathy Davidson. I'm truly delighted to briefly introduce Jennifer Nash before I pass the mic over to Nikki. She's the author of 4 monographs. She's the Jean Foxo-Barr Professor of Gender, Sexuality and Feminist Studies here, and she earned her PhD in African American Studies at Harvard University and her JD at Harvard Law School. She is the author of 3 already existing out-in-the-world books, The Black Body in Ecstasy, Reading Race, Reading Pornography, which was awarded the Alan Bray Memorial Book Prize by the GLQ Caucus of the Modern Language Association, Black Feminism Reimagined, which was awarded the Gloria Anzaldúa Book Prize by the National Women's Studies Association, and now Birthing Black Mothers, awarded an honorable mention for the Gloria Anzaldúa Prize by NWSA, all published by Duke University Press. Her 4th book, How We Write Now, Living with Black Feminist Theory, is also forthcoming with Duke University Press in 2024. The Black Body in Ecstasy, Reading Race, Reading Pornography, addresses pornography, race, and the possibilities of understanding pleasure in the context of a racist and sexist form of representation within which race is constituted through a repetitive performance of acts that can produce pleasure for actors as well as an audience. Intervening in the feminist discourses of anti-pornography, pornography, sex-positive and feminist porn studies, she provides an analysis of spectatorship within which a notion of difference comes to mediate the nonetheless racist and sexist codes of pornographic genres. Departing very respectfully from a canon of black feminist theory that quite rightly, in her view, bemoans the racist and sexist depictions of women, she finds what appears to be unthinkable within those texts, the possibility of ecstasy that runs with and against those narratives of oppression. Her careful understanding of the complexities of desire that cannot but be produced with and against relations of power allow her to turn also to think of racial pornography through the blaxploitation film. And she addresses the absurdity of pornographic narratives, which thus brings something of a relation to the comedic to a larger story of oppression. The examination of the use of multiple genres, the comedic, the ethnographic, blaxploitation, combine to offer a critical distance within which pleasure can be nonetheless experienced. Her book, Black Feminism Reimagined, is a very welcome step forward from thinking black feminism only in the terms of Kimberly Crenshaw's notion of intersectionality, a fascinating and useful concept to be sure, but one that has traveled and also one whose prominence obscures many other ideas that have been generated by black feminists. In Nash's hands, the juridical origin of intersectionality is still present to be sure, but also an effective relationship to that category and underscores the power and foreclosures of institutional black feminism. The topic of our discussion today will be her third monograph, Birthing Black Mothers, which is a reading of black maternal politics extending from a long tradition of black women's activism that mobilizes motherhood as a public and gendered site of political and effective power. I won't say more because that's going to be the topic of our conversation. And I will now thank Nikki for hosting the panel and pass over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. My name is Nikki Lane. I am an assistant professor in the Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies program here at Duke. I'm an interdisciplinary scholar trained as a cultural and linguistic anthropologist. And my work broadly deals with the issues of American popular culture, African-American language practices, and sexual cultures here in the United States. I bring up the point about African-American language practices or language in general because I'm just going to say one thing real fast. Because one of the things that I loved about Jen's book, Birthing Black Mothers, is that she's dealing with the discourse of crisis. And as someone who's very interested and invested in language, I was very interested to track with her the way that this use of this word crisis tracks around Black motherhood. And so today, what you can expect, other than my little flitterings about, today what you can expect is that each speaker will respond to the book for about 10 minutes. Some under 10 minutes, but about 10 minutes. Afterwards, Jen is going to make a comment and respond to colleagues. And then after that, we'll open up the floor for questions for the panelists as well as for Jen as well, okay? So that's how the flow will go today. I'm going to introduce each person as they speak, and we will start today with Joe Winters, the associate professor at the, he didn't know he was starting first. You can tell he didn't know he was starting. Joe's going to start us off. He's the associate professor in religious studies and African American studies with secondary appointments in English and in GSF, gender, sexuality, and feminist studies. His work lies at the intersection of Black religious thought, Black studies, and critical theory. His research examines the ways that Black literature and aesthetics develop alternative configurations of the sacred, piety, Black spirit, and secularity in response to the religious underpinnings of anti-Black violence and coloniality. His first book, Hope Draped in Black, Race, Melancholy, and the Agony of Progress, was published by Duke University Press in 2016. He's now working on his second manuscript, which I'm very excited about, titled Disturbing Profanity, Hip-Hop, Black Aesthetics, and the Volatile Sacred. Joe, would you like to get us started?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. So first, I want to thank you for that introduction, Nikki. Thank you. I want to thank FHI for inviting me to be part of this panel. I want to thank my co-panelists, esteemed panelists. And without a doubt, I want to thank Professor Nash, right, for this another amazing book that I've learned a lot from, and hopefully my comments will display just how much I've learned from your work, generally, particularly this particular text. First of all, is to think about how this particular text, what I see Professor Nash trying to do here actually is kind of continuous with, I think, a kind of strategy that I see in your other books, right? Which I would suggest is something like, right, providing a certain kind of corrective, right, or a challenge, right? Not rejecting, but a certain kind of corrective or challenge to certain kinds of limiting or confining tendencies within Black studies, and particularly Black feminist thought, right? Those confining tendencies might be within the discourse itself or the way in which Black feminism gets conscripted, right, and mobilized for certain kinds of projects, right? So, for instance, in the 2014 text, Black Body and Ecstasy, right, what I see Professor Nash doing, right, as Professor Khanna pointed out, is taking, right, golden age, right, pornography as a site to kind of rethink what she calls an archive of trauma, right? She says has defined kind of most of Black feminism, right, up to this point, right? So an archive of trauma, not dismissing that, right, but suggesting that we might open up space to think about pleasure, the ecstatic, the absurd, the comic, and so forth, right? So it's not a dismissal, right, of the work of someone like Hortense Spillers, right, and others, right, Patricia Hill Collins, but it's to say, let's open up space, right, to think other ways in which, right, Black women might think about pornography as a site of the ecstatic, pleasure, and so forth. And I take it that the ecstatic there is a way to think both the anguish and pleasure together, right? What I see in the 2018 text, right, Black Feminism Reimagined, after intersectionality, is a certain kind of either a corrective or a certain challenge to a tendency within Black feminism to be defensive when it comes to, right, particular concepts, particularly, right, intersectionality, right? The language actually that you use at times is the language of property, right? Almost as if it's like the property, right, of Black feminists, right? At times, I'm a religious studies scholar, so but I almost hear something like sacred, right? Right? Canon or something like that, or a certain genre of the sacred, right? We can talk about that, right? But a certain notion, and it's understandable, right? But I think you're suggesting here that if, right, that maybe a kind of surrender, right, to some of those concepts might open up possibilities, right, for Black feminism's world making, right, and generative possibilities, right? So again, this idea of not rejecting, right, but a sense of a corrective, right, or maybe even reading some of Black feminism's tendencies against itself in some way, right? So I take it in Birthing Black Mothers, right, as a way in which, right, what you're pushing back against, right, within maybe Black feminism, but also within certain attempts, right, by the state or by leftists to mobilize Black feminism, this tendency, right, to kind of conflate the Black maternal subject with crisis, right, or to, right, capture, right, or identify, right, the Black maternal subject, right, as a symbol of crisis, right? Think about it in terms of percentages, disparities, right, trauma, symbols of what's wrong with the system, right? You talk a lot about, you start off talking about, like, the mothers of the movement, right, and how the mothers of, often slain Black men are often seen as, like, have to take on the burden of mourning, grief, and sorrow, or other kind of affects, right, that might not be as disruptive, like rage, for instance, right, actually are not, are actually either disavowed, dismissed, or not taken as seriously, right? And so I take it that you're not at all denying, right, the ways in which, right, the Black maternal subject is under all kinds of duress and violence, right? But there's something about, again, the language or the grammar of crisis, right, that does something, that as a strategy, right, that actually overlooks, right, or actually overshadows something, right, or prevents us from seeing something, right? And I take it, I just want to, if I could just real quick, I did about 4 minutes before. I never know how long, right? Let me just make sure. I just want to just read this passage. Birthing Black Mothers probes a moment where the long-standing conditions of the ordinary have been newly framed as crisis, and where Black motherhood itself has become a site of cultural interest, empathy, fascination, support, and seemingly benign regulation, both by the biopolitical state and by Black feminists, as they've collaborated to figure Black mothers as living in crisis. This book argues that Black mothers in the United States have become spectacularly and dangerously visible through the frame of crisis, one that insists on their spatial and temporal location in a death world that is described as reminiscent of the nation's imagined past, even as it is consistent with the conditions of the unfolding present. And I'll just skip a little bit. The rhetoric of crisis is part of an enduring and troubling tradition of rendering Black women generally and Black mothers specifically into symbols, even if now Black mothers are symbols of tragic heroism and then, right, rather than deviance, right? So I hear something like, what we're seeing here is a rearticulation of something like the Moynihan Report, right? Whereas there, right, there's something about, like, you know, the black mother is seen as kind of deviant, or the black matriarchy is seen as, right, as representing black deviance. And here, there's a sense in which, right, the language of crisis, right, becomes still a way, right, for the state to right, regulate, right, to monitor, right, or to, in some way, in the language of support, to monitor blackness, and particularly black women, right, or to kind of regulate and contain black women, right? So what's interesting to me, and I'll just say this real quickly, the moment where you go to Lauren Ballant's work, the late Lauren Ballant's work, right? Well, one of the things that Ballant points out is that one of the problems with the language of crisis, right, is that it in some ways, right, disavows the ways in which that crisis is responding to a violence that is everyday and mundane and continuous. Right? Reminds me in some way of an author I think with at times, German Jewish intellectual Walter Benjamin has this line, right? For the tradition of the oppressed, the state of emergency, right, is the norm. It's not the exception, right? And so what I take it is that there's like one of the strategies that you're trying to push back against is the way in which, right, the grammar of crisis is almost always already connected to a certain idea that black women need to be rectified, saved, and rescued, right? Often by a state institution, right? And so, I had some more stuff to say, but let me just say this, right? I want to put this out there, right? I would love to hear, right, you know, again, as a religious studies person, to think about how your work generally, right, you know, speaks to religious studies, right? In the first text, you move to the ecstatic, right, which, you know, for me, it reminds me of someone like George Bataille, right, but the idea of being outside of oneself, right? I think about the way in which you're pushing back against a certain notion of black feminism or the intersection of being sacred, right? So you're pushing back against a certain notion of sacred. And here, what I hear in this text at times is pushing back against a certain kind of logic of redemption or logic of rescuing, that black women need to be saved, right? And that crisis language, not only saved, but an immediate, right? A kind of immediate, right? Something like that. But at the same time, in the Beyoncé, Michelle Obama, right, and Serena Williams chapter, there is a way in which you want to redeem the idea of redemption insofar as, right, with these, right, celebrities open up as a possibility of thinking about black maternal life, right, or the black maternal subject beyond, right, death, trauma, and so forth, right? So thank you all. I look forward to, you know, your response. Thank you, just in general, thank you for your work. I've learned so much from it, and I look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Winters. I'm going to pass it on to Jasmine Cobb now, who is professor of African and African American Studies and of art history, and visual studies at Duke. A scholar of Black cultural production and visual representation, Cobb is the author of 2 monographs, Picture Freedom, Remaking Black Visuality in the Early 19th Century, that's from New York University Press, 2015, and New Growth, The Art and Texture of Black Hair, yes. That's Duke University Press, 2022. She is the editor of African American Literature in Transition, 1800s to 1830. That's Cambridge University Press, 2021. And she has written essays for Public Culture, Melis. Y'all probably know what that is. Multi-ethnic literature of the United States and American literary history. Her 3rd monograph in progress, The Pictorial Life of Harriet Tubman. Ooh, that's gonna be good. That sounds good. Offers a visual history of the abolitionists from the middle 19th century through the present, including the persistence of the abolitionist image in contemporary art and popular culture. I'm very excited about that. Yes. Seriously. No, I'm not trying to be funny about that. Yes.
Thank you, and thank you for the introduction. Let's see here. Thank you to Ranji and the FHI for organizing this event. Thank you to Jen for inviting me into this conversation. I have an image on a slide maybe Sylvia can pull up for me so I can speak from here. It's for the end, but I'll begin now. So I'll be honest and say I had to ready myself to read Jen Nash's Birthing Black Mothers. I knew it would be insightful, sophisticated, and path-breaking, which it is, and which I would say about much of Nash's work. But I also knew that I might be faced with vignettes, with data, and with difficult accounts about the tribulations that Black mothers face in the 21st century. If you know me at Duke, then you likely know that I have 2 children. And so in reading this work, I knew that I would have to brace myself to sit with stories like the gut-wrenching and senseless death of Malaysia Goodson, killed by, among other things, environmental racism that shapes the New York City subway system. I knew I would be reminded again of epidemiologist Dr. Shalon Irving, whose death only 3 months postpartum took our collective breath, stopped us cold, Black moms like me with PhDs, who were reminded that in the 21st century, we cannot educate ourselves out of the statistical likelihood that we face worse chances for survival through child labor than white women with high school diplomas. These stories and countless others came rushing back to me as I sat with Birthing Black Mothers, a work that simultaneously acknowledges these women collectively, offering us a roll call, if you will, while also asking us to sit with the production of, quote, Black mother as a concept. If you think about the sheer idea of Black woman in the US, then you have encountered partus sequitur ventrum, the notion that children follow the mother, or that enslaved women gave birth to enslaved children. Nash asks us to take up this once material political reality and track it through the symbolic to sit with, quote, how Black mothers are relegated to the realm of the symbolic and how Black mothers work with, through, and against their symbolic currency, end quote. This emphasis on the symbolic helps us sit with the other difficult realities. Nash gives us insight into other realities, such as hotly debated disputes I've witnessed among Black mothers who are friends and colleagues with PhDs. And there is an ocean between them ideologically on topics such like breastfeeding. Breast is best versus fed is best. I mean, were it not for social media, I think there would be blows involved sometimes in these discussions. Here, Nash shows us the complicated reality that acts taken up, quote, to constitute a sign of resistance to the state, the corporation, and institutionalized medicine, end quote, are also essential to what she calls the, quote, contemporary visual resignification and recruitment of Black breasts, end quote, in public culture. And I think it is that ability to two-step, if you will, on this way in which there are no winners or losers. There are no strict heroes and strict villains on these subjects. Is part of what you do so beautifully in the manuscript. Indeed, Nash shows us that the visual takes us right to the heart of Black mother as a concept circulated in public culture, where celebrity women like Beyoncé, Michelle Obama, and Serena Williams render, quote, Black motherhood's imagined capacity to rewrite Black female feeling and perceptions of Black female feeling in a way that gestures towards the psychic and political redemption of motherhood, end quote. These women stand against the unwanted celebrity of grieving Black mothers like Sabrina Fulton and Samaria Rice, known to us for the state-sanctioned murder of their children. Nash shows us Black motherhood as a performance that can be marshaled to rewrite the present, making it more than an embodied experience or identity. And in showing us Black motherhood as an aesthetic and as brand management, Nash reveals to us the ongoing conception of Black motherhood as an apparatus that, for me, harkens back to the 19th century when white women abolitionists adorned their bodies with grieving Black mothers as a symbol of their feminine sympathies and political acumen. Then and now, Black mothers can be wounded survivors, but never enraged. All of this raises for me questions about in what ways and in what realms is Black motherhood not an apparatus? What do Black mothers know about the public, including public opinion, and what makes motherhood an apparatus in those areas? So I'll end with a clip. On the previous slide, did the link work? That's probably quicker. let's see. So this was a popular culture incident that happened recently. No? Okay. I put the next slide for backup. So childhood actress Keke Palmer got in big trouble because she went to an Usher concert postpartum and had a great time dancing with Usher in a totally sheer outfit, to which the father of her newborn took to Twitter to explain what was inappropriate about this performance. The image he retweeted and stated, "It's the outfit though, you are mom." And so I brought this into this conversation because I think this moment, aside from just titillating and fascinating as popular culture, I think for me, brings to bear some of this, the political realities facing Black moms, and when and how do Black mothers get to use the apparatus of motherhood to navigate the public. For folks who followed this, you know that she then levies this into other lucrative opportunities. And I think it tells us something about how adjacent to capital P politics Black mothers use the notion of what they should and should not do for gain. So, yeah, thanks.
We're going to move to Wam Wilson, Assistant Professor of Theological Ethics. Her teaching and research are at the intersection of bioethics, gender, and theology. She is former teaching faculty at Harvard Medical School Center for Bioethics, where she served as a senior fellow at the Harvard Divinity School Women's Studies and Religion program. She's also a former faculty member at Tuskegee University, where she was also the Associate Director of Education for the Tuskegee University National Center for Bioethics and Research in Healthcare. Oh, she earned her PhD in Religious, Social, and Ethics from Emory. Hey, ATL. And her book, Economics, Ethics, and the Black Church, was published in 2017 by Palgrave Macmillan. I'll pass it on to you, Mylan.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Nikki. Appreciate that. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I'm just going to jump right in. A little bit of what I say, I think, will address a bit of your question earlier. So for me, Jen's analysis of the different ways that we give scholarly attention to Black motherhood as political action, symbol, and embodied experience has been generative for my scholarship and my teaching, because our scholarship has provided these useful analytical tools for my research and work, as you've just heard, which is at the intersection of gender, theology, and bioethics. And her work has been formative for cultivating a nuanced conceptualization of Black motherhood, and important to my approach to bioethics from a womanist theological lens. So womanist theology originated with African American women religious scholars who felt that feminist theology and Black liberation theology did not give voice to their particular experience as religious scholars, both in the academy and the church. So my women's theological analysis of Black maternal health helps to demonstrate that bioethics, with its strong Western philosophical foundation centering white, male, upper class, heteronormative experience, proves inadequate in the face of injustice and oppression of marginalized populations. Therefore, I offer as a corrective my construction of bioethics that's grounded in a womanist theological methodology and philosophy, which centers the experience and struggles of Black women in the American healthcare system. And so this womanist construction of bioethics demonstrates how mainstream American bioethics is ill-equipped to rectify systemic oppressions. And additionally, I'm investigating these theological conceptions of motherhood and trauma as illustrated within biblical narratives of first Hagar, who is used to mirror Black women's experience of enslavement and surrogacy. And then secondly, the biblical narrative of Mary, mother of Jesus, who visits her relative Elizabeth while pregnant. And so I'm using these narratives to help communities for whom this sacred text is central, to help them evaluate their practice of accompaniment, solidarity, and care for Black mothers and Black birthing people. And so my purpose basically is to explore how theological conceptions are formative for ecclesial and social praxis regarding motherhood and Black maternal health. So central to this project is the need for what Monica Coleman argues is a womanist theology of Black motherhood that is unafraid to doubt and rant about faith, particularly in the face of Black loss and grief. Thus, Jen's work is generative for me as she provides fodder for my effort to read Black motherhood into Western theological discourse where it has been absent. For instance, within one stream of Christian theology in particular, the fear of becoming too political precludes some faith communities from dealing with varied social issues, thus leaving silence in the place of historical terror and extant Black pain. However, Jen's work on Black maternal memoirs and the political life of Black motherhood, which she beautifully weaves together in Birthing Black Mothers, assists me in problematizing theological narratives regarding motherhood. And so she's allowed me to strengthen my own womanist analysis through her modeling this astute reflexivity. And so in my dealing with womanist scholarship, which levels a critique of Black motherhood and work and problematizes notions of sacrifice, surrogacy, and salvation, I examine how the sight of Black motherhood and frank discussion of what it means to be a Black mother may change the questions that we ask and the way that we critique and construct theology. So even theologically, Black mothers' experience is marked by trauma. Moreover, mere survival becomes the theological good, and in some instances, salvation is equated with mere survival. However, there is a pushback and insistence that salvation is more than survival, and that salvation is found in community, self, and body as they're cobbled back together from being undone by the burden of sacrifice and surrogacy disproportionately borne by women of color. And so the push is for balancing these notions of sacrifice with care to achieve wholeness so that relationships, obligations, and connectedness and love are understood as these channels of sacred mystery, that our well-being includes the significance of such connections. So in light of this, Jen's book helps push me to be sensitive to this temptation of making women into symbols, right? She encourages all of us to be aware of and gives us tools to push back on these tendencies of pathologizing and romanticizing Black women for whatever ends, whether if used for the purpose of liberative, political, or theological work. And so her astute reflexivity, in her astute reflexivity, her book lays bare Black feminism's attachment to institutions and its conscription into state projects. But here again, she is helping me to think through the varied ways that womanism, likewise, is deeply attached to institutions, both university and the church. As she notes with the university, there's this cannibalization of thought. And I bear witness that through the church, like with the university, also there is an extraction of labor from Black women in detrimental ways. So as Jen has analyzed how, I quote, Black motherhood is imagined as a death whirl, and how Black feminist theory has become invested in reimagining and amplifying the potential power and possibility of Black motherhood, she's demonstrated how Black feminist theory performs its political work by reimagining feminism's relationship to motherhood, particularly popular feminist representations marked by ambivalence and unhappiness and obligation. And in contrast, Black motherhood is illustrated as powerful, strong, capacious, creative, and spiritually rooted as an act of life affirmation staged in or against a cultural moment that relegates Black bodies to the space of death. Mm-hmm. So Jen contends that Black mothering is then fundamentally reimagined from this site of anger and tenderness, a space of loss and ambivalence, into a site of intense spiritual and political meaning, a space where the self is powerfully remade through the sacred bond between mother and child. And in this cultural moment, Black motherhood is both a space of crisis and loss and of redemption, and powerful and densely loaded site of political meaning. In addition, and lastly, Jen is raising for us important questions about the materiality of Black women's bodies, reproducing under this presumption of crisis. And the question of, I quote, how do we Black feminists contend with the material consequences of telling Black mothers again and again that they are close to death, end quote. So she admonishes us to reimagine Black mothers as more than a political category with use value, even if for liberative purposes. So Jen, thank you so much for your dynamic and indispensable work.
I'm going to turn it over to Moon Shania, who is also in Atlanta. That's why I was so hype about ICO. Is an associate professor in international studies at Spelman College and the affiliate faculty in the Comparative Women's Studies program. She's the author of 2 books, Will the Real Pakistani Woman Please Stand Up? Empire, Visual Culture, and the Brown Female Body. And most recently, Archive of Tongues, An Intimate History of Brownness, Duke University Press, 2023. I'm very excited about this. In her latest book, Shania investigates brownness through the propagation of the maternal, the effacing of the brown maternal, and the abject maternal body are the driving vexations of her book. A recipient of a number of awards and fellowships, including a Rockefeller grant to study psychoanalysis in the Global South, a fellow at the Emory University James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference, and soon a fellow at the National Humanities Center. Shania has recently also been appointed as a Fulbright specialist to develop gender, sexuality, and feminist studies programs across the Global South. She's beginning a new book project on brownness and femicide. Very interested to hear about your work, Moon, and also have you in conversation with Jen. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. Can everyone hear me? Yes, okay. My warmest gratitude to Sylvia and to Ranjana for inviting me and for such warm hospitality. And it's truly such an honor to be in conversation with Jennifer Nash about her wonderful book, and especially since through your work, you have long been a teacher to me. Virginia Woolf once wrote, "Before we can write, we must kill the angel in the house." And I think Woolf's warning is apropos here in a meditation on Jennifer Nash's book, Birthing Black Mothers, and perhaps her oeuvre writ large, wherein Nash almost always kills the angel in our feminist politics. We saw this in The Black Body in Ecstasy, in Black Feminism Reimagined After Intersectionality, and now in Birthing Black Mothers. At first glance, birthing Black mothers feels like a counterintuitive critique of, might we say, the positive visibility of Black mothers in politics, culture, and in our higher learning institutions. Given the historical evacuation of Black mothers from the symbolics of motherhood, or the Spillerian fact that material conditions made mothering for Black women impossible, mother dispossessed was Spiller's phrase, or even more contemporaneously, the embedded homology of whiteness in motherhood. The universal mother is always imagined as white. We might also recall the deeply rooted Anglo-European abjection of the maternal. In psychoanalysis, for example, the mother has to be learned as the other in the mother, in order for the self to emerge. Language is the name of the father, achieved through a necessary and productive rejection of the desire-producing mother, which for psychoanalysts is exhaustingly always about the mother's breast. For Marx, revolution required forgetting the mother tongue. Freud, of course, totally pathologized the mother. And for Deleuze, the mother was a metaphysical, metaphorical, therefore disembodied entity. And Deleuze was one of the few theorists who appeared to actually like his mother. The white maternal then rises and recedes within the archives of theory, repressed or loathed, foreclosed or displaced. Even Donald Winnicott's good enough mother, developed some 20 years after Freud, is a white mother. So whether Deleuze or Lacan or any of the familiar cast of characters, Marx, Derrida, Freud, and others, the will to forget the mother shapes the Western canon, and they all do so in particularly dull, reductive, self-congratulatory, and misogynistic ways. It's hardly a stretch, then, to say that the mother of color is unthinkable within their epistemological frames. If these dead white men could speak, they would be hard-pressed to allow a Black or brown mother to pass through their tongues, except, of course, when they might be feeding off of her breast. Thus, visibility, recognition, and entry into discourse feels recuperative, maybe even reparative. While some of us sensate in the liberal fantasy that Black feminism has gained institutional authority and its insights are shaping political concerns, Nash exposes another field of the sensorium, the libidinal, and the symbolic, to argue that Black mothers have become a kind of political and intellectual currency through the mechanism of crises. Birthing Black Mothers explores the rise of the contemporary Black maternal discourse as one always and already tied to a violent woundedness, a woundedness which then confirms her sentience. Hortense Spiller's pornotroping also comes to mind here. Investigating what we might call the traumaphilia around the Black maternal, Nash offers a sharp and lacerating critique of the biopolitics of visibility, its accretions, its deceits, its blindness, its paralysis, and in moments, its sheer malevolence. If Rizwana broadly observed in her work what she called the warped absence of the Black maternal, and this was in 2017, Nash conversely draws our attention to the contemporary multiplication of discourses around the Black mother. Through a great range of uncanny metaphors and materials, Nash incisively confronts accounts of Black mothering, breast milk as Black gold, the politics of the birthing room, the Black doula as armor against what Toni Morrison described in Paradise, the cool hands of white men, the stylized aesthetics of Black celebrity mothers, and the melancholia and ambivalence of the feminist maternal memoir. Each chapter is vertiginous in its knowledge, cracking open the racial and gender terms in which white anxiety and liberal ethics transform Black mothers into assimilable figures that deploy racial corporealities even as they erase them. If one visual field is tied intimately to rendering Black mothers likable and digestible to the broader economy of white compassion, another produces a Black futurity that is kind and earnest, and yet another constructs the Black breast as a key technology of Black life, and in so doing, semi-criminalizes formula, for example. The mainstreaming of images of Black women breastfeeding, for example, injects a little eros into a culture of death. It formulates a new index of failure and shame on one hand, or on the other hand, of well-being and futurity, corralling Black mothers into happier and healthier motherhood, or yet again tying it to loss and woundedness and lack. Personally, I found many of the adverts, PSAs, and public health materials Nash examined on breastfeeding so patronizing. But it's important to note that each discursive and paratactic circulation of affect, a Gap ad displaying a Black mother nursing her toddler, Michelle Obama as mom-in-chief, or the fabulousness of the Black maternal aesthetic, Beyoncé or Serena, are all intimately tied to the biopolitical deployment of media assemblages, producing Black mothering to promote self-regulation among them. Indeed, each field functions as an aphrodisiac of liberalism, to borrow Jasbir Kaur's phrase. Necropolitics, we know, is about governance that requires the killing of certain populations, while biopolitics is the will to life or to let die. But biopolitics is also a capacitation machine. It produces an ascendancy to a particular kind of citizenship. This cannot be reduced to whiteness, but neither is it unrelated nor unhinged from what we might understand as whiteness. In the cunning of biopolitical regimes, whiteness is more than ontological. It is a condition one aspires to. It is about mastery over self and over others. I think for me, this was one of the most compelling and discomforting arguments that Nash makes, perhaps compelling because it was so uncomfortable. This thinking through the difficult contradictions when Black feminist thought and practices become institutional narratives, sanctioned rationales, moneyed opportunities, symbolic victories, and media fabulousness. Nash illuminates how our liberatory practices, including Black feminism, get entangled with the state, the medical institution, and the university. She compels us to think about how institutions institutionalize, how Foucault had warned us of the fine line between states, universities, prisons, and asylums. Nash reminds us that identity politics cannot secure coherence or act as a conduit for political change because regimes of violence exceed and anticipate these positionalities, often so comprehensively that we too fall into its seductive embrace. Reading Birthing Black Mothers, I was struck by the force of biopolitics, seductive, unseen, life-making, subject governing. Certainly, when it comes to the lives of unmarried mothers, poor mothers, Black mothers, brown mothers, immigrant mothers, queer mothers, most mothers, the state nor the hospital has never been a particularly trustworthy advocate. Quite the contrary, the state has always taken a suspicious stance, engaging in typically punitive surveillance of non-normative mothering, birthing, and living that many subaltern women have developed as a survival strategy in the context of poverty and racism. By highlighting the complex terrain of Black maternity, Nash consecrates a particular kind of feminist politics, one that compels her readers to think more ethically, more carefully, more slowly, and perhaps even more ordinarily about Black mothers. The racialized subject is, by definition, a susceptible subject, and as such requires a critical approach that can accommodate such ambivalence. This is something both Nash and I think about in different ways in our work. That's not my timer, right? Okay. Okay, in my recently published book, Archive of Tongues, An Intimate History of Brownness, I investigate brownness through the provocation of the maternal. I move through intimate autopsies of brown maternal experiences such as illegal abortion, corrosive sexual objectification and violence, disability, injury, illness, brokenness, slow life, fast death, and the varying states of losing one's speech, one's tongue. I conceptualize the tongue as an embodied epistemological cipher. Thus, I read it closely, fold it out as a theoretical intervention, to shake loose imperceptible forms of violence, to throw into relief the obscure relationships between sociality, opacity, irony, misery, and dissonance of the maternal subject I am trying to understand. As I read Nash's book, I found myself worrying, have I produced an archive that is yet another site of melancholic cannibalism, where the object of my desire is better fragmented, devoured, consumed, swallowed, rather than lost? What did my writing metabolize? Whom did I put at risk? In my work, I position the brown maternal as ludic, dislocating, interstitial, and deterritorializing, an affective cathexis contoured by sex, gender, misogyny, and brownness. I develop brownness as a hermeneutic that touches, slides into, converges with, remains aloof to, and diverges from the global and diasporic field of Blackness. Eclipsed and accelerated by coloniality, brownness can spurn Blackness even as it stumbles in its own uncertainty, in its own precarity. And this different genealogy of violence and survival and ascendancy matters. The general distancing of the South Asian diasporic subject from the provocative, fleshy task of Black studies, with of course few exceptions, pits the immodesty of the transatlantic slave trade against the more modest colonial practices of the British and South Asia. The British, we like to tell ourselves, were not consuming our flesh, even as we might recall that both Black and brown women's breasts were technologies of white life during colonialism. I'll close then by offering a few questions that perhaps we can think about together. One, Birthing Black Mothers brings a new frame to the question of the Black maternal. It thinks of the maternal across color lines, through varying biopolitical machinations, and through hegemonic and counter-hegemonic erotics, arts, sensations, socialities, and memories. What are the conditions of possibilities for mothers of color? How might we think of the metaphoricity of Black and brown maternal together? Two, Birthing Black Mothers takes a risk in its feminist politics, and I deeply appreciated this. I'm curious about how you might think of this subversive feminist subject and how feminist politics is in a way always about what gets lost, violated in patriarchal institutions, and a stubborn, unruly, wild refusal to let go of that loss or violation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And last but not least at all, Deirdre Cooper Owens, Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies at the University of Connecticut, a popular writer and speaker. Dr. Cooper Owens has published both scholarly and popular pieces, I'm old now, on issues that concern African American historical experience and reproductive justice. She is an Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer, a past American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists Fellow, and has won several prestigious honors and awards for her scholarly and advocacy work in history, reproductive, and birthing justice. Her first book, Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology, won a Darlene Clark Hine Book Award from the Organization of American Historians as the best book written in African American women's and gender history. She is currently working on a popular biography of Harriet Tubman that examines her through the lens of disability, and a monograph about the history of race, medical discovery, and the C-section. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Cooper Owens. Turn it over to you.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to be here and to be in response to Professor Jennifer Nash's book. But first, thank you for inviting me, for having me to be a part of this panel and to be in conversation with someone who is not just prolific, but also really brilliant. And so I'm going to start this by saying, because I travel a lot, I didn't write it down, so you're going to get the extemporaneous version of Deirdre Cooper Owens. So please be with me. I'm thinking as I talk. But I wanted to start this off by this saying that, I'm sure many of us heard, a hit dog will holler. And let me tell you why it's applicable here. As I'm reading Birthing Black Mothers, right, and I've read lots of books about the birth of American gynecology, birthing a slave, right, all of these things, I started to feel real uncomfortable. And I had a visceral response because I was like, oh, she going after folk like me, who see Black mothers as pathological. Not we see them, but we're writing about people who frame Black mothers as pathological and criminal and abnormal. And I'm like, didn't she know the 21st century medical studies where people still believe this? And so I had to put the book down. As I was watching, I promise you, that's my mama. But that's another thing, right? 1970 sitcom for those who are Gen Z. So, and so I had to put it down. And I called a friend who told me, this book is brilliant. And I was like, yeah, I'm feeling real convicted, about scholars like me. And then I had to get outside of myself. I recognized that was ego. And she had no conception of Deirdre Cooper Owens when she was writing this book. And what really was important as I picked it back up and really broadened the way that I had to process and digest the information was we can't stay stuck in the ways that we see Black women and Black mothers and birthing people, and that there are transformations that happened. And so allow me if I do the historian thing. Oops, I didn't start my timer because I know I can talk and go over 10 minutes and I don't want to do that.
I got you.
Okay, good. We had a code. She's going to do some movements to tell me if I'm going too long. All right. So the historical thing is I started thinking about the ways I had been socialized to think about Black mothers. And you did something totally different. So, and when I first started to hear about Black mothers as this, I'll use your term, a kind of framing device for how we also think about Black women was in the slave narrative, right? We think about Frederick Douglass talking about his mother's 24-mile round-trip trek to see him because they lived on different plantations. And then as I started to think about a little kid in the late 1970s in the Atlanta child murders, right? I was in Washington, D.C. at the time, in elementary school, and as I did some more research, I learned in 1979, Camille Bell, right, and the other victims' mothers created the Committee to Stop Children's Murders. Direct quote, when Black women use motherhood's power to advocate for Black lives, right? Then I was in high school in 1985, and all of a sudden there was the invention of the crack mom who produced crack babies. 1988, Ella's song, Sweet Honey in the Rock, we who believe in freedom cannot rest, right? We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes, until the killing of Black men, Black mothers' sons is important as the killing of white men, white mothers' sons. I was in my second year of college in 1991 at Bennett College, right down the road, and this song hit the urban airways. Your mama's on crack rock, not my mama, right? And then in 1999, as we know, the NYPD murdered Amadou Diallo, and his mother, Kadiatou Diallo, wrote a memoir, My Heart Will Cross This Ocean, My Story, My Son, Amadou. And in her memoir, she offered a new description of her son. And she said, I like to imagine how people might have perceived the situation if I had been allowed to define him with the label of my choosing. He would have been good-hearted, stepping out for air, loved by his mother, young man. And when I started to realize this was you told us, but I was being stubborn, a geopolitical framing of Black mothers in the era of Black Lives Matter, that things were not static, that in fact, even the ways that I had been wedded to the tropes of Black mother and motherhood and mothering had changed. And so here you are responding, as you say, to the kind of capaciousness of what that creativity and that transformation means, right? That yes, the Black mother still elicits a kind of response of compassion and care because the Black mother is seen as being in crisis, largely because of the killing of Black men, young Black men or boys. But there was something else too, that Black women are taking a kind of ancestral and cultural knowledge that had been produced in their institution building. And that became really important for me. And so there were these wonderful ways where you write, and this was really, where was it? It was the last one. You were saying in the coda, this book is animated by a different impulse. What it means for a Black feminist theoretical project and politic to be undergirded by a desire to understand the variety of Black mothers' political needs and the multiplicities of their affects, ranging from grief to rage, from trauma to ecstasy, right? And so, you know, if I can harken back to that kind of, that's my mama playing in the background when I was having my own, kind of spiritual reckoning with reading the book and feeling convicted. I was like, wait, that is our mamas, right? And all of the diversity and the beauty. And it's not about this kind of romanticization that says concretized, but it is this way about how people are moving and pushing the needle and to even change language around parenting, right? That they're not just mothers, but also birthing people who are raising children and those kinds of things. So I was struck with not just the brilliance, but also the bravery of literally saying, you know what, we can actually do better than staying in these kinds of tropes of trauma that have defined Black mothers in parenting. And that we can think more creatively and we can think compassionately about these things. And so what I started to think about was the ways that you did it. You were offering correctives and chastisements, but you did it in a way where you didn't feel, like someone was wagging a finger at you. And so I was curious in this Black Lives Matter era, why there wasn't a focus on, the emergence of the single baby mama, right? Oftentimes, that person is seen as in crisis because they are sexually immoral, right? And so I wanted to just hear a little bit about that. Also, this was really important. You brought up, for some of you, I'm sure you've heard of it, but this concept of weathering that was coined in 1992 by, I always get the first names, so I have to look, Arlene Geronimus. But anyway, it was this sense of Black women, and I'm using the 1992 language because I'm a historian, right? She wasn't using birthing people at that time. But that Black women, because of the daily assaults of racism, they wear that, like not just externally, but also internally. And so, of course, as a person who does medical humanities, I started to think about epigenetics and the kind of biological trauma that is such a part of these kinds of conversations. And I just wanted to hear maybe some more thoughts on that. Also, I thought this was, and this is a comment, not really a question, but I thought you had a really smart way of looking at this antagonistic relationship that a lot of reproductive justice activists had with the state. So they're highly critical, right? We have to take care of ourselves. We all we got, right? We've heard this, right? And yet when the state is like, all right, we're gonna implement some of these solutions that you've offered us, it's like, what are y'all doing? Right? And so that I thought was a really brave way of kind of holding the mirror up. And then the last one is crisis as an impetus for the action of creativity. When one is in crisis, you are constantly thinking of creative ways of living and being. And I also thought about, this is, I think, embedded in your work, the kinds of ways that that a lot of RJ organizations and activists have commodified Black mothering under the guise, and I don't use guise as a judgmental term, so please don't take that, but kind of under the covering of Black philanthropic capitalism. And so I wanted to hear a bit more about that as well. Because even though it's a service, right, a large part of this is many of the RJ activists and Black mamas ain't been getting paid. And so all of a sudden you can provide this service to your community members, but also it's a kind of new capitalism, right? And so I wanted to hear your thoughts about that. So thank you for making this hit dog holler and thinking much more creatively about the birth of Black mothers. This was a really brilliant book. Thank you.
That was our panel. Thank you. Can we just have one round of applause for the panel? Now I'm going to welcome Jen to make some comments and respond.
Yeah, thank you all. So I want to thank Ranji for the invitation. I really appreciate it. And Sylvia for all of the work, which I know is complicated, to get us all here in this room. Thank you. And I want to extend gratitude to these amazing panelists, Moon, Joe, Jasmine, Wylan, and Deirdre. Thank you for your comments. You've given me so much to think about as I revisit the work. And Nikki, thank you for moderating. I really appreciate it. So I had written some short comments as I was reflecting on the book, and I'm going to try to weave those together with responses to some of what you all raised, and then we'll just talk more in the Q&A. So in the acknowledgments of birthing Black mothers, I note that the book was born with my daughter, or more specifically in the weeks before her birth. And so I'm thinking with you, Jasmine, about bringing our children into the room, right? So I wrote the book as I started thinking about the book as I navigated life as a Black perinatal subject. And indeed, my curiosity about the hospital, the birthing center, the obstetrician, the midwife, the doula, and the lactation consultant, alongside my interest in the categories I found myself inhabiting and resisting: prenatal subject, postpartum subject, patient, mother, breastfeeder, consumer in the marketplace that undergirds the feminist birth industry. All of this launched the early inquiries that became this book. When this project began, I wanted to think about how my body was managed and surveilled in a moment where institutionalized medicine was newly aware of an old problem, the Black maternal health crisis. And Wylan, as you were talking, I realized I was also really interested in this is sort of where the book ends and what it meant to have to perform a certain kind of good Black motherhood by always being on guard, right? And this idea of like, I'm going to the doctor's office and I've read the studies and I know about weathering and I know about obstetric racism, and that's actually folded into the construction of good Black maternal subjectivity now. I wanted to understand what it meant to birth in a moment when the very fact of my birthing or soon-to-be birthing body was saturated with a different kind of political meaning, and this gets to some of what you were talking about, Deirdre, about the historical moment, where my body was imagined not as pathological, but as in need of education, information, support, and compassion. Mm-hmm. The new attention to the crisis surrounding Black motherhood had engendered a profound cultural shift, and that's really where my book was born. Black motherhood is now cast as suffering, as tragic, as traumatized, rather than deviant, or maybe it's deviance of a different kind. I wanted to also explore and expose how and why this shift felt alluring to Black feminists and Black birth justice activists, and how and why we Black feminists should find other frames for thinking about Black maternal life and death. So to go to some of what you said, Joe, which was sort of thinking about the book in the context of some of my other work, I've spent much of my scholarly life contending with the symbolic and metaphorical work that Black women perform in the US, for the state, the university, the corporation, for the US left, and for Black feminism itself. I've also long been interested in Black feminism's multiple institutional iterations and entanglements. Here, I think, is where you talked, Joe, about my desire to think about certain conforming tendencies within Black feminism and my desire to correct certain things. So here, my desire has not been to treat Black feminism as a project that was once anti-institutional that has become co-opted. This, I think, is a prevailing narrative about Black feminism. Instead, I've long tracked Black feminism as a theoretical and intellectual tradition that has always had institutional longings, affiliations, and attachments. Birthing Black mothers took these longstanding preoccupations of mine and brought them to the context of the hospital generally, and the delivery room specifically, thinking about what happens when Black feminist ethics, ideologies, and frameworks move into medical spaces, and also when those ethics, ideologies, and frameworks create their own seemingly oppositional spaces. And here I'm particularly thinking of some of the work that I try to do, thinking about the work of Black women doulas, particularly in Metro Chicago. I understood the book's central questions, particularly its investment in thinking about Black mothers' newfound visibility as crisis objects, as rooted in the context of Black Lives Matter. And this goes to your comments, Deirdre. As I argue in the book, even as Black Lives Matter is often described and at times criticized for placing Black boys and Black men at the center of a conception of anti-Blackness, I make a different argument in the book. I contend that Black mothers have become the central icon of the movement for Black life, a political currency deployed repeatedly by the left in particular, even as I also think there are interesting ways in which Black mothers are signifying themselves and making themselves into certain kinds of currency. I talk at length in the book about, for example, the mothers of the movement appearing on stage with Hillary Clinton at the DNC to confer a kind of respectability upon her. At times, Black mothers are described as representing anticipated loss, as preparing themselves and their children for anti-Black trauma that is to unfold in the future. Other times, Black mothers are culturally invoked to make visible the trauma of losing a child already, and thus become synonymous with grief that has already unfolded. With the new cultural visibility of long-standing Black maternal health disparities, birthing Black mothers are now imagined, in perhaps the most literal way, to be vessels of Black life. In this moment, the moment that I write about in the book, anti-Black death is understood to take the form not only of the police officer's fist, baton, or chokehold, but also the form of the unwanted C-section, the racialized disrespect and indifference that mark so many Black women's experiences of institutionalized medicine, and ongoing disregard for Black women's pain. So I started writing this book in 2018 and finished it in 2020 in the midst of the early days of the pandemic. And COVID, of course, rewrote everything, including cultural conversations about birth politics, and race and maternal health. So I wanted to say something about that before wrapping up. The pandemic shifted cultural expectations around the where of birth and the how of birth, among other things. So I've been quite interested in the growth in home births, which are no longer described entirely as sort of fringe practices, but during COVID were actually described as responsible practices of birthing outside of the death world of the hospital. We also saw this moment where hospitals actually had to make the case for their legitimacy as places where people would want to birth. And I also became interested in shifts in the how in birth. So the growth in doula-assisted labor as a pandemic survival strategy, alongside, if you remember, sort of early pandemic days when states were barring doulas from entering delivery rooms or creating seemingly endless bureaucratic hoops for doulas to jump through to gain entry to delivery rooms. COVID heightened existing racial disparities. The number of birthing people in the US who died during pregnancy or shortly after increased in 2020, and 1/3 of the pregnant and postpartum people who died were Black. Doulas, who I talk about at length in my book's second chapter, gained more attention than ever, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A, as media, both local and national, celebrated doulas' work as frontline responders to the dual pandemics of anti-Blackness and COVID. In a recent article championing doulas' labor, the New York Times noted, quote, "Doula support for a Black mother is like giving Black mothers a cape." State and federal Momnibus Acts have also been part of the story, earmarking money to build what Joe Biden has called a birth workforce and extending Medicaid coverage to include doulas. Joe Biden celebrates Black Maternal Health Week every April. Black Breastfeeding Week is every August. And so I note all of this to just really to amplify the increasing visibility around Black maternal health and crisis. And yet, as Danielle Jackson suggests, and I write about her in my book, despite attention, compassion, and encouragement showered upon Black mothers, there has also been legislative inertia and, of course, the persistence of death. If Linda Villarosa's New York Times article in 2018, which I argue in my book, sort of inaugurated journalistic coverage of Black maternal health, a New York Times Magazine article called Why America's Black Mothers and Babies Are in a Life or Death Crisis, if her article inaugurated a long season of attention, the CDC has found that the racial maternal mortality gap has only increased since the publication of that article. The logics of the hospital persist, even when they are not housed within the hospital, and the interventions proposed and often not implemented do far too little to disrupt these logics. When I finished writing this book, and this is an image that appears towards the end of the book in the coda, birth activists in New York City were talking about Shaw Asia Semple. In July 2020, she went to Woodhull Medical Center, a public hospital in Brooklyn, for a routine stress test a few days after her delivery date. Her doctor observed that her blood pressure was high and recommended induction. A few hours later, he botched her epidural, and she died, or perhaps more precisely, was murdered. A few days later, protesters gathered outside of Woodhull. That's the image that's included in my book. They carried signs that connected Semple's death to Black Lives Matter, that connect obstetric racism to anti-Blackness, that think about the so-called twin pandemics of COVID and anti-Black death. They were, in other words, trained in the vocabularies of the moment my book thinks about, and could recognize the Black maternal body as ground zero of multiple and intersecting crises. The crisis formulation that brings Black mothers into view briefly as tragic and heroic subjects in need of support did little to challenge birth landscapes, including the tremendous gaps in maternal medical care within cities. In fact, there remains far too little conversation about disparities within places and how they shape the birthing experiences of Black people. My book was written when I was in Chicago, where maternity wards on Chicago's South Side were closing because they said that they didn't have enough folks who wanted to birth there, and Northwestern Hospital's downtown state-of-the-art maternity center had never been busier. So there's a lot to say about geography and birth. Woodhull Hospital is one of New York City's 11 public hospitals. It delivers 1,500 babies a year. 85% of its patients are Black or Latina. In the wake of Semple's death, there was a new, brief attention to Woodhull's troubling safety records, showing that from 2014 to 17, women delivering there had serious emergencies, strokes, or severe bleeding at 2.5 times the rate of hospitals statewide. In the 2 years before Semple died, 6 other pregnant patients at Woodhull suffered adverse outcomes related to anesthesia, in almost all cases involving the same doctor, the one who botched Semple's epidural. Though there was a clear pattern of malpractice, no one intervened until late 2021, when the doctor's medical license was revoked. But this flicker of attention to the neglect that was at the heart of anti-Black maternal non-care at Woodhull treated Semple's doctor as a singular bad actor, and singular hospital administrators as negligent. It did little to explore the birthing geographies that relegate so many Black birthing people to deserts of non-care where neglect is normalized. A few months ago, the New York Times reported on the 3-year anniversary of Semple's death, and I'm thinking here with you, Moon, about the biopolitics of visibility. The article features a picture of Semple's partner, Joan Lopez, and Semple's daughter, Chloe, now 3 years old, standing in front of a mural in Brooklyn's Bed-Stuy neighborhood. The mural says, "Rest in peace." As I read it, I was reminded of anthropologist Haley Cole's warning that the amplification of discourse around Black maternal crisis, the attention to crisis, often replaces actual political labor to improve the lives of Black birthing people and their children. As Cole writes, quote, "The contemporary urgency around elucidating the dilemma of Black maternal and infant death has in many ways become a means of capitalizing on the spectacle of Black suffering and death. Semple's story is a lesson for me about how the crisis frame can be so alluring in that it offers attention, however ephemeral, to singular stories of Black death, and to, in the words of the New York Times article, a baby growing up motherless. But what remains is the political stasis around the violent non-care that is part of ordinary perinatal life for so many Black birthing people." So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open it up. Okay. Jasmine is going to dip out, as we say. Is that the correct term? Yeah. Okay. She's going to dip out in about 5 minutes. So if you have a question for Dr. Cobb, please raise your hand first. We have time for Q&A. How much time do we have for Q&A?
It's
3:23.
Well, we have food in the back, but let's have some.
Let's say we have 10 minutes then for conversation. Are there any questions for the panelists, for Jen, for Jasmine especially, who has to, as I said earlier, dip out?
Hi. Hi everyone, I'm Naz. My question is for Jen or for anybody up there. I'm asking out of genuine ignorance. I'm wondering if you found in your research and in your work any tension between the mobilizing of the Black mother and the Black maternal in grief of, her child's loss. If there's been any tension between that and the sort of other political movements going on now, being pro-choice and abortion, I'm wondering what space there is, if any, for Black bodies and their right to choose, and sort of the politics of abortion in the midst of all of the, dynamics that you've all so well explicated.
Sure, I'm happy to go first, and then if others want to jump in, feel free. I wrote the book before the disaster of Roe being overturned. But one of the things that struck me, and here I'm particularly thinking about interviews that I conducted with doulas, was how much folks mobilized the language of being warriors for life. And in fact, a couple of my interlocutors talked about what might it mean to reclaim or reinflect the term pro-life in a kind of Black feminist way. And so I'm thinking in particular about one of my interlocutors who talked about how the act of catching a baby was for her an act of welcoming Black life into the world with tenderness, and her hope was that that act would carry through and mark that child's life for the duration. And so again, this was all pre-questions of abortion rights sort of being at the forefront of my interlocutors' minds, but it was interesting to hear this real desire to reclaim the term pro-life and think it differently. So.
Yeah, I very briefly will say, in fact, before I came here, I was in conversation with two OBGYNs here and an oral historian. It was kind of like, oh, so what do the RJ folk, what do they have to say about abortion? And I was like, so it's not that it's unimportant, but the conversations I have with activists are very much more about how do we maintain, create, and better life here. And so in many of the organizations where I'm affiliated, we will have folk who will have the talking points, right? They're kind of the spokespeople for the abortion issue, but folk are much more interested in, okay, so this is a food desert, or we don't have a birthing center or maternity ward, or we only have one midwife here, or, there's environmental racism going on. And so those are the conversations that are amplified and that we tend to focus on, where it's less about the abortion as the front and center conversation and discussion. And so you're right, I'm finding that kind of just across the country, where I'm having these conversations with birth workers and reproductive justice activists across the board.
In your work, Dr. Owens, you remind us that there are archives that are yet to be uncovered to fully expose the white patriarchal dynamics that still have fatal effects on our health system, among others, which current reproductive restrictions have made it particularly urgent to uncover those dynamics and history. So how do we leverage that urgency of the work that's still yet to be done while being conscious on the narratives which Dr. Nash calls our attention to, that we are creating about Black motherhood that can be particularly tokenizing and have real impacts on the lived experiences of these mothers?
I wrote that. So lots of things, like you said, like Jennifer Nash said, when she was writing this book, it was before Dobbs, and things are transformed as you're writing it. I don't necessarily know if all of the archives need to be disclosed.
Interesting.
Because of the ways that so much Black ancestral knowledge that stems from a very woman-identified world has been co-opted and commodified, I'm having a real problem with people being all about the cash and not keeping something sacred. And so I'm struggling with that. I mean, as a historian, you're basically telling people's business who didn't give you permission, especially when you're writing about people who lived in the 18th and the 19th century. And so I need to learn more around what ethics means when you're writing about populations who literally, they're not here to give you permission, and what that actually means when things are being commodified and marketed in ways where there seems to be a growing money grab culture around that. So I am not sure how to answer that and articulate it in the best way, but it is something that I'm struggling with. But what I would say is, in terms of understanding the archives that we have now, just continue to read the silences and the gaps. That's what Black feminists taught us for decades, and it still applies.
Hi. I was kind of interested in. I was kind of interested in seeing if you think because of COVID, like the positionality or like the understanding of like Black motherhood needs to like shift on like a theoretical level, and this is for everybody, or if it's like rather anti-Black violence has just been exacerbated, but prior to that it doesn't really require like a different theoretical intervention. And I'm thinking about this especially with regards to like, I feel like after the vaccine and whatever was created, there's been like a really like science was really put on a pedestal at that moment, and especially with like the push of like frontline workers and being like, I feel like medicine almost like became a really glorified field, and I'm almost thinking about how does that interact with like Black motherhood and like birthing and all of these processes.
I can throw out two things, and then we can just see what other folks want to say. I mean, I think part of what I'm interested in the book is this kind of grammar that's formed, the new grammar. And so when I talk about the protesters in front of Woodhull and how they're trained in a grammar that's been developed by both Black feminist activists and reproductive justice, Black feminist intellectuals and reproductive justice activists, I'm interested in this like taxonomy of obstetric racism and sort of medical violence and like obstetric justice, like these kind of new frameworks that have been developed. So you say frontline workers, and one of the things that's so interesting to me is sort of post-2020, how folks will talk about doulas, midwives, lactation consultants as frontline workers, right? Mm-hmm. And I think this, again, that moment in 2020 when doulas were not allowed into hospitals, and this moment when, at least in New York, many folks had to birth alone, right? Because partners weren't even allowed into delivery rooms, right? So suddenly you were faced with this question, do I want to birth alone or do I want to just birth at home, right? Yeah. Which feels safer? So this idea of doula work as frontline work, as essential labor, is a vocabulary that we've developed through the pandemic that I think opens up possibilities and also might close certain possibilities, right? And so I want to think about those grammars, the vocabulary that we've sort of developed collectively.
I've not read the book, so I have a lot of homework that I need to do. But one of the things that I appreciate in your setup is the discussion of Black mother as deviant Black Mothers Crisis. And the thought that I have in my mind is April Ryan's latest book, Black Women Will Save the World. Have you all read this? Are you familiar with it? So I haven't read it either. That's another one on my to-do list. But within the course of this conversation, I wonder, is there a way to then look at, which doesn't necessarily make it non-problematic, but a way to look at Black maternity, Black motherhood in this redemptive site, in this redemptive way? And if any of you have any thoughts about that.
Thank you for the question. In some way, my reflections were thinking about how the grammar of crisis becomes an occasion for, right, like the biopolitical mechanisms to be like, oh, yeah, we can, to step in and say we can save and rescue Black women. What you're getting at, though, is that maybe a more subtle understanding that, right, a certain kind of suffering or surrogacy, right, a certain kind of suffering is already placed within a framework in which, right, Black women are seen to be kind of salvific figures, right, or Black maternal. We can think about it in terms of the Black maternal. We can also think about it in terms of every 4 years in the election, Black women saving democracy, and something like so. So I'm thinking. So that's got me thinking. I just got to think more about it. But it could be that, go back to the language of surrogacy, right, and Dolores Williams' work and your work, right, just to think about how it could be that we're thinking about is how the language of crisis and suffering, right, is also linked to maybe a way in which the Black maternal is always already scapegoated, but also in some ways doing this kind of salvific work. But that salvific work is part of a certain kind of violent extraction at the same time. I don't know if that makes any sense, but you got me thinking about, thinking about it. So, thank you.
And I think I'm thinking of us, though, of people who are trying to write against a moment that romanticizes Black motherhood and really want to think about questions of labor, right, and the extraction of labor. So thinking of someone like Sherry Randolph, who's writing this kind of history of quote-unquote bad Black mothers, thinking about Black women who refused motherhood, who gave up their children. She's writing about Camille Phillips, thinking about a student at Northwestern, Candace Merritt, who's writing about Black women who murder their children, and this desire to really think about what might happen if Black feminism as an intellectual tradition put these kind of so-called bad Black mothers at the heart of our project, right? Or thinking about the refusal of motherhood and care work, right, as a radical act, rather than the moment we've landed in, where more and more care work is what's seen as a kind of quintessential radical practice.
We have one more question. Can you raise your hand again? Yeah.
You wanted to do a little follow-up.
Yes, and I appreciate all that. I'm thinking of it outside of the context of creating Black women in a way in which they've never been perceived. So not necessarily romanticizing, but this idea that, which I think April Ryan's trying to get to in her book, is this notion that this presence in society is always having to uplift it, is always having to redeem it or take it to the next level.
Hi, thanks for taking my question, and this is for all panelists, really. And so, in thinking of the afterlife of slavery, which I believe you lead a chapter with that phrase, and how that is part of slavery being part of colonial violence. I'm wondering if you could comment on global narratives of Blacks and really African birthing people, and I'm also thinking of the really starting from slavery with the Margaret Garner case until now, and how these narratives travel around the world, and how they're exchanged.
Give me a minute. Let me think for a minute. Yeah. Someone else?
Sorry, I was actually thinking to ask a question because I'm from Jamaica. So my experience was growing up with Black women in a very different way. And so while I was listening to all of you, it was fascinating, but I was thinking, comparing it to how my image of the Black mother was completely different coming from a Black country. And so I was wondering how much of it is being obviously affected by growing up in, Black mothers in America and that white experience. But I do think some of the negative connotations that I grew up with about black mothers comes from America. And when I think back about school and how we were taught about black women and black mothers, it was of their strength. And we have a national hero called Nanny. And so I grew up with that image of this warrior woman. And so it's fascinating, and I really enjoyed all of you. Thank you very much. But I do think it's very different across the globe in different countries.
I think I'll maybe add a response. Just what I'm hearing, I don't know if I can necessarily speak to the kind of traveling figure of the black maternal across water and borders, but more so that, when we talk about mothers and the maternal is, it's a field, it's a figure that's so weighted by the symbolic, by mythology that, as someone who just completed a book on my own mother, it's, the weight of that symbolism kind of bleeds onto the page, and it's so, I think, difficult. And I think this is one of the things Jen is trying to do, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but is to, how do we talk about the maternal, both within and through that field of symbolism, but also extract and separate and unhinge the kind of, I guess the inevitable term is this, the romance, the sentimentalization, that the minute we say mother or the maternal, that it follows so quickly. And so whether it's this, very lovely image of the strong warrior mother, or whether it is of a figure that is cast by white logics of coloniality, regardless, it's doing the symbolism, the kind of weight of mythology of the maternal it's almost inescapable. It's like molasses. You can't move through it. And I think for those of us who are writing about this, it's a real tension to say, how do we write, which is very ordinarily about the banality of, and in that field of banality, also the banal violence, the quotidian violence of being a mother of color. That's useful.
I just wanted to add, even with, thank you for bringing that up, just in some of the advocacy work that I've been doing, speaking to black birth workers from different nations who've immigrated here, and to talk about the ways that the communal knowledge is passed was really interesting to me. So like binding stomachs and, after birth and all of those kinds of things, right? Using certain oils and those things, prepping the body, that I thought about. I was like, wait, but these are still countries where the transatlantic slave trade was still flourishing. Yeah. It's still proved, disruptive. And so there is something about a majority black nation and those that are not, right? That's important, but I think what Jen's book really brings into focus is to think about crisis in a much more nuanced way, right? And so even if Nanny is seen as the central figure for black strength, she wouldn't have to be strong if she wasn't fighting, right, these colonial slave masters. She could just be. And so what you're saying is the crisis, as you said, it provides a framing device for us to really think about that. And I think we can still use that framing device of crisis as we're thinking about these kinds of black Atlantic, transatlantic worlds, where you're thinking about the enterprise of slavery and colonialism and how it shaped our lives. And so it's wonderful to have those kinds of figures, but it's still something that, I'm not saying it's not born out of black creativity or intelligence, but the crisis forces you to have to create a different way or ways of being that you wouldn't otherwise have to contend with without the slavery. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time. Thank the panelists. Thank the author. And y'all can thank me, too, the moderator. Thank y'all.